My name is April, 34 years old, from Boston, and cooking has always been my passion despite having no formal training. For 10 years, I've been married to James, and together we have an amazing 8-year-old son named Ethan. Recently, a family dinner became the turning point in our marriage when my husband's mockery about my cooking, which had become a regular pattern, finally reached its breaking point. I never expected that my son would be the one to stand up for me when I couldn't find my own voice. If you've ever had your passion mocked by someone you love, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like and subscribe button before I continue with a story that changed everything for me. I grew up in a home where cooking was never a priority. My mother worked 2 jobs to support us after my father left when I was just 5 years old. Our meals typically consisted of whatever could be microwaved, defrosted, or picked up on her way home from her second shift. The closest thing to home cooking I experienced was when my grandmother visited during holidays, bringing with her the incredible smells and tastes that made those rare occasions feel magical. As a child, I would stand on a step stool in my grandmother's kitchen during those visits, watching in wonder as she transformed simple ingredients into dishes that brought our family together. She never used recipes claiming cooking was about feeling and love rather than precise measurements. Those memories stayed with me, a stark contrast to the everyday reality of TV dinners and fast food that defined my childhood. When I moved into my own apartment after college, I found myself staring at an empty kitchen with absolutely no idea where to begin. I was 23, armed with a business degree and a decent job at a marketing firm, but completely clueless about how to feed myself properly. The first month, I survived mostly on cereal sandwiches and takeout, essentially repeating my mother's pattern out of necessity rather than time constraints. That all changed when I stumbled across cooking channels on YouTube one lonely Friday night. I was instantly captivated by how accessible they made cooking seem. The next day, I bought my first cookbook and some basic kitchen equipment. My earliest attempts were disasters: pasta overcooked to mushed chicken dried out like leather vegetables, reduced to unidentifiable soggy masses. But with each failure came a lesson, and gradually cooking became both my hobby and my therapy. By the time I met James at my friend Lisa's barbecue 3 years later, I had become confident enough in my self-taught skills to bring a homemade peach cobbler. I still remember the chorus of compliments from the other guests, all except from James, who merely took a polite bite and set it aside. At the time, I barely noticed, too captivated by his charming smile and the way he listened intently when I spoke. It wasn't until our third date that I learned about his culinary background. James came from what he called a food family. His mother, Laura, was known for her legendary Sunday roasts, his father, Robert, had perfected the art of grilling, and his younger sister, Samantha, had actually trained as a professional chef in France before opening her own catering business in New York. "You should taste my mom's cooking," he told me over drinks. "Nothing compares to it." When I nervously mentioned my own growing interest in cooking, his response seemed encouraging on the surface. "That's cute. Maybe Mom can give you some pointers sometime." Looking back, I should have recognized the condescension in that statement, but I was too smitten to read between the lines. Instead, I saw it as an opportunity to connect with his family through something I was growing to love. The first time I cooked for James, I spent the entire day preparing what I thought was a fairly impressive roasted chicken with herb butter roasted potatoes and a simple salad. I was so nervous I nearly dropped the plate setting it in front of him. "Not bad," he said after taking a few bites. "The chicken is a little dry, though. And did you use dried herbs? Fresh makes all the difference." Rather than feeling discouraged, I took notes. I wanted to improve, and I naively saw his critiques as helpful guidance from someone with more experience. Each time I cooked for him, I incorporated his feedback, genuinely believing I was getting better under his tutelage. By the time we got married a year and a half later, I had filled notebooks with tips and techniques gleaned from countless cooking videos, books, and James's ongoing commentary. I was determined to eventually impress his family, particularly his mother, Laura, who had eyed me with thinly veiled skepticism from our first meeting. "You're not what I expected for James," she told me once while we were alone in her kitchen. I was helping her prepare dinner during our first holiday together as an engaged couple. "He's always been drawn to more accomplished women." The comment stung, but I smiled through it. "Well, I'm learning every day," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Was all she said in response before criticizing the way I was chopping carrots. After we got married, I threw myself into mastering the domestic arts with even more determination. I wanted to create the kind of warm, food-centered home environment that James had grown up with, despite my lack of such traditions. Each dinner I prepared was an act of love, sometimes received with mild appreciation, other times with pointed suggestions for improvement. When I became pregnant with Ethan, cooking took on new significance. I researched nutrition, obsessively wanting to provide the best possible nourishment for our growing baby. James's critique shifted to concerns about my choices. "Are you sure you should be eating that?" Or, "My mother always said pregnant women should avoid that ingredient." After Ethan was born, food became a battleground in ways I hadn't anticipated. James questioned everything from my decision to breastfeed to when and how we introduced solid foods. His mother sent articles and books that often contradicted my pediatrician's advice, all presented under the guise of helpful guidance. As Ethan grew, I found joy in cooking for him in a way that was different from cooking for James. My son's face would light up with genuine pleasure at the simple pasta shapes I made for him or the funny pancake animals I created for Saturday mornings. His appreciation was unconditional and pure. "Mommy, you make the best food in the whole wide world," he would declare, his face smeared with tomato sauce or maple syrup. Those moments sustained me through James's increasingly frequent criticisms. What had once seemed like constructive feedback had gradually morphed into mockery and comparison, especially when his family was around. "This is good, April," his sister Samantha might say, "but have you ever tried adding white wine to the sauce? It really elevates the flavor profile." Or his mother would bring backup dishes to our dinner parties, just in case people want options. Over time, I stopped cooking when James's family visited, ordering takeout instead, to avoid the inevitable criticism. But that only led to different comments. "Oh, April's giving her kitchen a rest tonight." Or, "I suppose not everyone has the time to prepare home-cooked meals these days." By our 10th anniversary, I cooked 2 separate styles of meals, simple, heartfelt dishes when it was just Ethan and me at lunch, or when James worked late, and elaborate anxiety-inducing productions when James would be at the table, each one prepared with equal parts love and fear. What had started as a journey of self-discovery and passion had become a source of insecurity and stress. But through it all, Ethan remained my most enthusiastic supporter, always ready with a thumbs up and a request for seconds. His unwavering belief in me was the pilot light that kept my love for cooking from being completely extinguished. I just never expected that his simple faith would become the catalyst for the biggest change in our family dynamic. A change that began with a pot roast and 5 words that would finally force James to see what he had been doing all these years. It started with a phone call. James's parents were coming to visit for the weekend, and his sister Samantha would be joining them. They were passing through on their way to a family wedding we couldn't attend due to Ethan's school commitments. "Mom wants to know what the plan is for dinner on Saturday," James said, relaying the message while barely looking up from his phone. "I could cook," I offered, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. It had been almost a year since I'd prepared a meal for his entire family. James finally looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Are you sure that's a good idea? We could just order from that Italian place they like." "I want to cook," I insisted, a sudden determination taking hold. Perhaps it was the approaching milestone of our 10th anniversary making me reflective, or maybe I was simply tired of hiding my passion when his family visited. "I've been practicing some new recipes." "Whatever you want," James replied with a shrug that clearly communicated his doubts. As he turned to leave the kitchen, he paused. Just don't make it too experimental, okay? You know how they are. I did know how they were, which was precisely why I wanted to make this dinner special. After a decade of marriage, I was still seeking their approval, still hoping to be fully accepted into their tight-knit culinary circle. For the next 5 days, I obsessively planned every detail of the meal. I decided on my grandmother's pot roast recipe, a dish I had been perfecting for years, adjusting the seasonings and cooking time until I believed it rivaled any restaurant version. The meat would be accompanied by roasted root vegetables, homemade bread rolls, a spring salad with my special vinaigrette, and a chocolate soufflé for dessert. I created shopping lists, timetables, and even practiced the bread twice to ensure it would be perfect. Ethan became my enthusiastic assistant, donning a little apron I had bought him for Christmas and solemnly tasting each component. "This is going to be the best dinner ever, Mom," he assured me, his face serious as he helped me knead dough on Thursday night. "I hope so, buddy," I replied, trying to infuse my voice with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. On Friday, I took a rare day off work to shop for ingredients. I splurged on an expensive cut of meat from a specialty butcher rather than the supermarket, carefully selected the freshest vegetables, and even drove an extra 20 minutes to a bakery supply store for high-quality chocolate for the soufflé. That evening, as I was prepping some components ahead of time, I overheard James in his home office, the door not quite closed. He was on the phone, his voice low but distinct. "Yeah, April's insisting on cooking tomorrow," he was saying, and I immediately recognized he was talking to his sister. "I know I tried to talk her out of it." A pause. "Well, we should probably have a backup plan. Last time she attempted a roast, it was like eating shoe leather." My hands froze over the carrots I was peeling. The dinner he was referencing had been over 2 years ago, when I'd been called into an emergency meeting and the roast had overcooked. It was the exception, not the rule, yet here he was presenting it to his sister as if it were indicative of my general cooking ability. "Just maybe have some delivery menus ready," he continued, chuckling. "Or we could always claim we're taking everyone out after." I quietly set down the peeler and walked away from the kitchen, my excitement for the dinner now tainted with a familiar anxiety. That night, I lay awake beside James, wondering why I was putting myself through this again, why I continued to seek approval from people who seemed determined to withhold it. The answer came in the form of Ethan's sleepy voice at breakfast the next morning. "I told my teacher that my mom is the best cook in the world, and she's making a special dinner for Grandma and Grandpa," he announced, spooning cereal into his mouth. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "That's sweet honey," I replied, ruffling his hair. "I hope the dinner lives up to your advertising." "It will," he said with absolute certainty. "Everything you make is delicious." His simple faith renewed my determination. I would make this dinner perfect, if not for James and his family, then for Ethan, who never doubted me. As the day progressed, my kitchen transformed into a command center of culinary operations. The pot roast went into the oven by 2 o'clock, filling the house with rich aromas. The bread dough rose exactly as it should, and the vegetable prep went smoothly. When the doorbell rang at 5:30, I took a deep breath, straightened my carefully chosen outfit, and nodded to myself in the hallway mirror. "You can do this," I whispered. But the moment I opened the door, I felt my confidence begin to waver. Laura swept in first, air-kissing my cheeks before immediately asking if she could freshen up after their drive. Robert followed with a genuine but brief hug, then moved past me to greet James. Samantha was last, balancing what was clearly a dessert box in her hands. "I brought my famous tiramisu," she announced. "Just a little something extra. I know you're handling dinner." The extra dessert felt like a statement of distrust in my abilities, but I smiled and thanked her, taking the box and placing it in the refrigerator beside the chocolate soufflé ingredients I had so carefully prepared. In the kitchen, My careful timeline began to collapse as Samantha hovered nearby, offering unsolicited advice. "You might want to add a bit more salt to that," she commented as I worked on the sauce for the pot roast. "And if you have any red wine, a splash would really deepen the flavor." "This recipe doesn't call for wine," I explained, trying to keep my voice light. "Well, recipes are just guidelines, right? That's what we learn in culinary school, to trust our instincts." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that she was a guest in my home. Instead of responding, I focused on setting the table, arranging everything with care. Ethan helped me fold the napkins into the fancy shapes he'd learned from a YouTube video, his little face serious with concentration. By the time we all sat down for dinner, I was a bundle of nerves, but still hopeful. The pot roast looked perfect as I placed it in the center of the table, tender, succulent, surrounded by caramelized vegetables. The bread rolls had come out golden brown and fluffy, arranged in a basket lined with a cloth napkin. Everything looked and smelled exactly as I had imagined. "Well, this certainly looks interesting," Laura commented, her tone making the compliment sound suspiciously like criticism. "April's been planning this meal all week," James said, and I detected a note of warning in his voice, as if preparing his family for disappointment. "Mommy worked super hard," Ethan added proudly. "She even let me taste test everything." "Well, then it must be good," Robert said, the first genuinely positive comment of the evening. He smiled at Ethan, then at me. "It smells wonderful, April." I carved and served the pot roast, my hands trembling slightly as I placed portions on each plate. Then I passed around the sides, holding my breath as everyone took their first bites. The initial responses seemed positive. Murmurs of "mmm" and polite nods circulated the table. For a brief shining moment, I thought perhaps I had finally succeeded in impressing them. Then James took a bite of the meat, chewed thoughtfully, and made a face I knew all too well. "It's a bit tough, isn't it?" he said, looking to his mother for confirmation. Laura took another small bite, dabbed her lips with her napkin, and nodded. "It's certainly different from how I make pot roast. I find a longer cooking time at a lower temperature produces a more tender result. And the seasoning is quite bold," Samantha added, reaching for her water glass. "In professional kitchens, we tend to let the quality of the meat speak for itself with more subtle flavoring." "I think it's really good," Robert offered, continuing to eat steadily, but his lone positive voice was drowned out by the others. "Mom's food is the best," Ethan declared, happily taking another big bite. "That's because you haven't tasted your grandmother's cooking much," James replied with a laugh that made my stomach clench. "Remember that pot roast you made for my birthday last year, Mom?" Laura launched into a detailed description of her cooking method, which apparently involved a special Dutch oven that had been in her family for generations and a secret blend of herbs she grew herself. Samantha chimed in with professional tips about meat selection and aging. I sat quietly, pushing food around my plate as my appetite disappeared. The conversation drifted to other culinary disasters they had witnessed or experienced, with James steering it increasingly toward my past kitchen failures. "Remember that Thanksgiving turkey?" he asked, laughing. "It was so dry we practically needed chainsaws to carve it." That had been 3 years ago when I was recovering from the flu, but insisted on cooking anyway. I had fallen asleep briefly while the turkey was roasting, and it had overcooked. I had been mortified then, and the memory still stung. "Not everyone has the cooking gene," Laura said, patting my hand in a gesture that felt more patronizing than comforting. "Some people have other talents." "Maybe cooking just isn't for everyone," Samantha agreed. "That's why there are professionals. Speaking of which, April, I'd be happy to give you some basic lessons while I'm here. Just some fundamental techniques that might help." I opened my mouth to respond, but James cut in. "That would be great, wouldn't it, April? Samantha could show you how it's really done." The conversation continued to spiral as they swapped stories of culinary excellence that implicitly highlighted my inadequacies. I tried to participate to defend myself, but each time I started to speak, someone would talk over me or redirect the conversation. Then came the moment that would change everything. James took another bite of the pot roast, made an exaggerated face, and delivered the line that would become the breaking point. "Even a stranger could cook better than this." His family laughed, Laura behind her napkin. Samantha more openly, though Robert merely frowned into his plate. I sat in silence, feeling as though I'd been slapped. 10 years of criticism crystallized in that single moment, and I suddenly saw with painful clarity the pattern of belittlement that I had endured in the name of love and self-improvement. My hands shook in my lap. I couldn't look up from my plate, couldn't trust myself to speak without my voice breaking. A pressure built in my chest, a mixture of humiliation and rage that threatened to explode, and yet I remained frozen, conditioned by years of similar moments to simply endure. The laughter continued for what felt like an eternity, until it was suddenly cut short by a sound that pierced through the mockery, the decisive clatter of a spoon being placed firmly on a plate. The sudden silence around the table was deafening. All eyes turned to Ethan, whose small face had transformed from its usual cheerfulness to something far more serious. He sat up straight in his chair, looking directly at his father with an expression that seemed too mature for his 8 years. "Mom's food is made with love," he said, his high voice clear and unwavering in the quiet room. The simple declaration hung in the air. James's smile faltered, then vanished completely as he registered the disappointment in his son's eyes. "You're being really mean, Dad." Ethan continued, his tone more sad than angry. "Mom worked really hard on this dinner. She let me help and taught me how important it is to put love into food. That's what makes it special." I stared at my son, a lump forming in my throat. In all the scenarios I had imagined for this dinner, I had never considered that my greatest defender would be the youngest person at the table. James looked stunned, as if he'd been physically struck. "Buddy, we're just joking around," he tried to explain, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "It's how our family talks about food." Ethan shook his head firmly. "It's not funny. It's mean. You made Mom sad." All eyes shifted to me, and I realized that tears had begun silently streaming down my face. I quickly wiped them away, but it was too late to hide the evidence of how deeply James's words had cut. "The boy's right," Robert suddenly spoke up, setting down his fork. It was the most I'd heard him say all evening. "The food is delicious, April, and more importantly, you put your heart into it. That deserves respect, not ridicule." Laura and Samantha exchanged uncomfortable glances. James opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, resembling a fish out of water. Ethan stood up from his chair and walked around the table to my side. He wrapped his small arms around me in a fierce hug. "It's the best pot roast ever, Mom," he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Something broke open inside me then, not in the shattering way of more heartbreak, but in the releasing way of a dam finally giving way after years of pressure. All the hurt, all the belittlement, all the swallowed responses rose to the surface. I hugged Ethan back, drawing strength from his unconditional love, then gently guided him back to his seat. I took a deep breath and finally found my voice. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, surprised by how steady I sounded. "And thank you, Robert." I turned to face James, meeting his eyes directly. "But my son shouldn't have to defend me in my own home, and certainly not against my husband." James's face flushed. "April, come on, it was just what, James? Just another joke at my expense, just another opportunity to make me feel small. Do you even realize how long this has been going on?" The words poured out of me, years of suppressed feelings finding their release. I described how his criticism had gradually morphed from helpful suggestions to outright mockery, how I had come to dread cooking for him despite it being something I once loved, how his family's attitude had always made me feel like an outsider. Every meal I've cooked for the past 10 years has been an offering of love. I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. And almost every time you found some way to criticize it, to compare it unfavorably to your mother's cooking or your sister's professional standards. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To have something you pour your heart into consistently judged and found wanting. The table had fallen into a shocked silence. Samantha stared at her plate. Laura's mouth formed a tight line, and Robert nodded slightly as if confirming something he had long suspected. I never meant to, James began, but I wasn't finished. The worst part is that I believed you, I continued. I thought there was something wrong with my cooking, with my efforts with me. I kept trying to improve to meet some impossible standard, but tonight, I finally see it clearly. The problem was never my cooking, James. The problem was that you couldn't recognize the love behind it because you were too busy looking for flaws. James looked genuinely shaken. April, I had no idea you felt this way. I thought you knew I was just teasing. Teasing is when both people laugh, Ethan said quietly, repeating something his teacher had obviously taught him about bullying. Mom wasn't laughing. James stared at his son, then back at me, the realization dawning in his eyes that his behavior had not only hurt me, but had been observed and absorbed by our child. I think perhaps we should go, Laura said, breaking the tense silence that followed. This seems like something you two need to discuss privately. No, I said firmly, surprising myself again. This is my home, and this is the dinner I prepared. Everyone is welcome to stay and enjoy it respectfully, or you're welcome to leave if you prefer. But I'm not going to pretend anymore that these jokes don't hurt. And I'm not going to teach my son that it's okay to sit silently while someone you love is belittled. Robert was the first to respond. The food is excellent, April. I'd like to stay and enjoy it if that's all right with you. Of course, I replied, feeling a surge of gratitude toward my father-in-law, who had always been the quietest member of James's family, but who now seemed to be the most perceptive. The remainder of the dinner proceeded in an awkward silence, occasionally broken by stilted attempts at neutral conversation. Ethan, seemingly satisfied that he had made his point, returned to his meal with the resilience of childhood, though he kept shooting concerned glances my way. When dinner was over, Laura and Samantha declined dessert, claiming they were too full. I didn't bring out the chocolate soufflé I had planned, nor did Samantha suggest serving her tiramisu. Instead, they made excuses about needing to check into their hotel early, despite the original plan for them to stay overnight at our house. As they gathered their things to leave, Robert pulled me aside in the hallway while James was helping his mother and sister with their bags. I've always enjoyed your cooking, April, he said quietly. And more than that, I've appreciated how you've tried to make us feel welcome despite, he glanced toward his wife and daughter, despite it not always being easy. James is a lot like his mother in some ways, but he's not a bad person. Just a bit blind sometimes to how his words affect others. Thank you, Robert, I replied, genuinely touched by his kindness. That boy of yours, he added with a smile. He's got a good heart, strong sense of right and wrong. You're raising him well. After they left, I put Ethan to bed, his innocent questions about the evening difficult to answer. Why was Dad being mean about your food, Mom? He asked as I tucked him in. Sometimes people get into bad habits without realizing it. I explained, searching for the right words. Dad didn't understand that his jokes were hurting my feelings. But now he knows right, so he'll stop. I hope so, sweetie. People can change when they realize they've been hurting someone they love. I'm glad I told him to stop, Ethan said, his eyelids growing heavy. Your food is the best because it's made with love. That's what you always tell me. That's right, I whispered, kissing his forehead. And you're the best son because you're made with love too. After Ethan fell asleep, I found James sitting alone in the living room, the television off, his expression thoughtful. The confrontation I had been avoiding for years could no longer be postponed. The house felt unnaturally quiet after the chaos of dinner and the hasty departure of James's family. I stood in the doorway of the living room, watching my husband as he sat motionless on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. For a moment, I considered retreating, falling back into our pattern of avoiding difficult conversations. But Ethan's courage had awakened something in me that refused to be silenced again. I walked into the room and sat in the armchair across from him, rather than next to him on the couch, a small act of independence that didn't go unnoticed. James looked up, his expression a complex mixture of defensiveness, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "They left earlier than planned," he said, stating the obvious. "Yes, they did," I replied, simply not offering him the comfort of elaboration or excuse. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from moments when he felt cornered. "Look, April, I think things got blown way out of proportion tonight. You know how my family is about food. It's just how we talk. It's never been meant to hurt you." The old April might have nodded, might have accepted this explanation to keep the peace. But I could still feel the sting of his words, still see the disappointment in Ethan's eyes when he witnessed his father's cruelty. "Intent doesn't erase impact, James," I said quietly. "You might not have meant to hurt me, but you did. And not just tonight, for years." "Years? Come on, that's an exaggeration." "Is it?" I challenged him. "When was the last time you praised something I cooked without adding a but or a suggestion for improvement? When was the last time you defended me when your mother or Samantha made those little digs about my cooking? Do you even realize that I stopped making my favorite recipes because you always found something wrong with them?" James fell silent, perhaps mentally reviewing our history and finding more truth in my words than he wanted to admit. "I didn't realize it bothered you so much," he finally said. "You never said anything." "I shouldn't have to explicitly tell my husband not to mock me in front of his family," I countered. "And I did try to tell you in smaller ways. I've asked you to be more supportive. I've told you how much effort I put into meals. You just never listened." "So this is all my fault?" A flash of the defensive James I knew so well. "This isn't about fault, James. It's about recognizing a pattern that's been hurting our marriage and deciding if we want to change it." I took a deep breath. What happened tonight was just the most public version of something that's been going on for years. But what made it different was that Ethan noticed, and he spoke up when I couldn't. The mention of our son seemed to penetrate James's defenses. He winced visibly. "I never wanted him to see me that way," he admitted softly. "None of us want our children to see our flaws," I acknowledged. "But now that he has the question is what you're going to do about it." "What do you want me to do? Just never comment on your cooking again? Walk on eggshells in my own home?" I shook my head, frustrated by his reductive interpretation. "I want you to be mindful of how your words affect the people you claim to love. I want you to consider that maybe, just maybe, there are ways to express preferences or make suggestions without belittling someone's efforts. And yes, sometimes I just want you to eat the damn food and say thank you without critique, especially when we have company." James was quiet for a long moment. "I still don't think it's as serious as you're making it out to be." That was when I realized we needed more than just this conversation. The pattern was too entrenched, the behavior too normalized in his mind. "I think we need professional help, James. Couples counseling." His head snapped up. "Counseling over some comments about dinner? That's an overreaction." "It's not just about dinner," I explained patiently. "It's about respect. It's about the fact that you think it's acceptable to mock your wife in front of your family. It's about teaching Ethan through our example what marriage should look like." When he still looked resistant, I decided to be completely honest about where I stood. I can't keep doing this, James. I can't keep pretending that these jokes don't hurt, that your family's behavior is acceptable, that this is the kind of marriage I want. Either we get some help to figure out how to communicate better, or I need to seriously reconsider our relationship. The gravity of my words landed like a physical weight between us. James stared at me, perhaps seeing for the first time how close I was to my breaking point. "You'd leave over this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to leave," I said truthfully. "I want us to be better. But I won't continue in a relationship where I'm constantly made to feel inadequate, especially in front of our son." James sat with this for several long minutes. I waited, not filling the silence with reassurances or softening my position as I might have done in the past. "Okay," he finally said. "We can try counseling, but I still think you're blowing this out of proportion." It wasn't the enthusiastic commitment I had hoped for, but it was a start. "Thank you for agreeing to try," I said. "That's all I'm asking for right now." We talked a bit longer, the conversation circling through James's defenses, my hurt, and the tentative possibility of change. When we finally ran out of words, an uncomfortable silence settled between us. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight," I told him, standing up. "I think we both need some space to process." He looked surprised, but didn't argue. "Ethan will notice if you're not in our room. I'll talk to him in the morning. He's perceptive enough to understand that adults sometimes need time to think." That night, alone in the guest bed, I cycled through a storm of emotions. Sadness for the years I had allowed myself to be diminished, anger at James for his blindness to my pain, fear about the uncertainty of our future, and underneath it all, a surprising sense of pride. Not just in Ethan for his bravery, but in myself for finally drawing a line. I had spent so long trying to earn approval through my cooking, seeking validation from people who were determined to withhold it. Perhaps it was time to remember why I had fallen in love with cooking in the first place, not for praise or recognition, but for the joy of creation, for the love expressed through nourishment. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking not of James or his family's judgment, but of my grandmother's kitchen and the simple wisdom she had tried to impart to me all those years ago. Cooking was about feeling and love rather than precise measurements or external validation. Somehow, my 8-year-old son had understood that truth more clearly than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with Ethan, uncomfortable adjustments to our family dynamic, and the daunting prospect of couples counseling. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep without the weight of inadequacy pressing on my chest. My son's 5 simple words, "Mom's food is made with love," had done more than shut down my husband's mockery. They had reminded me of an essential truth I had lost sight of somewhere along the way. Love shouldn't have to earn its worth through perfection. 3 months after what Ethan innocently referred to as the pot roast night, our family had settled into a new rhythm, still awkward at times, but increasingly genuine. The journey through couples counseling had been more challenging and revealing than either James or I had anticipated. Our first session was tense, with James initially presenting our issues as a simple misunderstanding about dinner table etiquette. But our therapist, Dr. Martinez, gently but persistently guided us toward deeper conversations. "What I'm hearing," she said during our second session, "is that this isn't really about cooking at all. It's about respect, validation, and patterns of communication that have developed over your 10 years together." James had been resistant at first, viewing therapy as an admission of failure or an attempt to assign blame. But by our 4th session, something began to shift. Dr. Martinez had asked him to reflect on his own family dynamics growing up. "Food was always a competitive thing in our house," he admitted reluctantly. "Mom would criticize Dad's grilling. Dad would make comments about Mom's desserts being too sweet. Samantha and I would try to outdo each other with techniques we'd learned. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just how we showed we cared about food." And did it feel cruel sometimes? Dr. Martinez asked. James was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, he finally acknowledged, especially from Mom. Nothing was ever quite good enough for her. That revelation opened the door to exploring how James had unconsciously recreated the critical environment he had grown up in, perpetuating a cycle of perfectionism and judgment that had been normalized in his childhood home. I never connected the dots, he told me later that night as we processed the session. I thought that's just how people who care about food talk to each other. I didn't realize I was making you feel the way Mom sometimes made me feel. It wasn't an immediate transformation. There were setbacks moments when old patterns emerged and had to be consciously redirected. But the simple acknowledgement that there was a problem marked the beginning of real change at Dr. Martinez's suggestion. I joined a local cooking club, a monthly gathering of amateur home cooks who shared recipes and techniques without competition or judgment. The first time I brought one of my dishes to share, I was so nervous my hands shook as I set it on the table. I half expected to hear the familiar critiques, the subtle suggestions for improvement. Instead, people enjoyed the food, asked for the recipe, shared their own stories of kitchen triumphs and disasters. One woman, Maria, became a particular friend after she tasted my lemon garlic chicken. "This reminds me of how my grandmother used to cook," she said, closing her eyes as she savored a bite. Simple ingredients, but prepared with such care. Food that feeds the soul, not just the body. I came home from that first meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. James noticed the change immediately. "You look happy," he observed cautiously. "I am," I replied. It felt good to cook without fear of judgment. His face fell slightly, and I could see him processing the implications of my statement. "I'm sorry that I made you feel that way," he said after a moment, the words still awkward but increasingly sincere with practice. We were learning a new language together, one of acknowledgement, apology, and adjustment. In therapy, we identified other areas where similar dynamics had played out. My career choices, my parenting decisions, even my clothing and appearance had all been subject to subtle critiques disguised as helpful suggestions. "You married someone from a very different background than yours," Dr. Martinez pointed out to James. "Instead of appreciating those differences, you've been trying to mold April into someone who fits your family's expectations." Those conversations were difficult, often leaving us both emotionally drained, but they were necessary, peeling back layers of assumptions and unexamined behaviors that had been slowly eroding our connection. Ethan, meanwhile, watched the shifts in our relationship with the keen observation of children missing nothing. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked, "Are you and Dad going to get divorced?" My heart clenched. "No, sweetheart. Dad and I are working through some things, but we both love you very much, and we're trying to make our family stronger." He considered this solemnly. "Because of what happened at dinner that night?" "Partly," I acknowledged, never wanting to lie to him. That night helped us see some problems that had been there for a while. Sometimes it takes something big to make grown-ups realize they need to make changes. Like when I didn't notice my shoelaces were untied until I fell down and got hurt, he suggested. I smiled at his simple wisdom. Exactly like that. "I'm glad I said something," he declared. "Dad's being nicer now." "You were very brave," I told him, "and you helped both of us see something important." 6 months after the pot roast incident, James's parents and Samantha visited again. I had been anxious about the dinner for weeks, despite the progress James and I had made in therapy. "We can set boundaries," Dr. Martinez had reminded us in our session the week before their visit. "You can be respectful without allowing old patterns to reemerge." The night before they arrived, James sat down with me at the kitchen table after Ethan was in bed. "I want to talk about tomorrow," he said. "I know you're nervous about them visiting." I nodded, not bothering to deny it. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said about boundaries, and I want you to know that I'm on your side. If Mom or Samantha starts with the food comments, I'll speak up. You shouldn't have to defend yourself in your own home. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by his commitment. That means a lot. And I was thinking, he continued, maybe we could cook dinner together, not because I don't trust you, he added quickly, seeing my expression change, but because it might be nice to make it a team effort. Plus, it would show them that I value what you do. It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one. The next day, we worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing a meal that incorporated dishes from both of our backgrounds. My grandmother's famous cornbread, alongside a roasted vegetable recipe James had learned from his mother. Ethan helped too proudly assigned the important job of taste tester. When his family arrived, there was an initial awkwardness, a careful politeness that acknowledged without directly referencing the tension of their last visit. Laura brought a bottle of wine rather than a backup dessert, a small but noticeable change. Samantha complimented the table setting, but refrained from offering unsolicited cooking advice. The real surprise came from Robert, who pulled me aside early in the evening and handed me a small wrapped package. A little something I thought you might like, he said with a kind smile. Inside was a handwritten recipe book, the cover inscribed with family favorites. As I flipped through it, I realized he had collected recipes from both sides of the family, not just his own mother's and wife's specialties, but also several pages of recipes from my grandmother that he must have asked James to get from my mother. I thought it might be nice for Ethan to have both traditions, he explained. And maybe we could all learn something new. Dinner that night wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, old habits threatening to resurface. But when Laura began to make a comment about the texture of the cornbread, James gently intervened. Actually, Mom, I helped make that, and I think it turned out exactly right. It's different from yours, but that's what makes it special. Laura looked surprised, then thoughtful. Of course, she said after a moment. Every family has their own way of doing things. After dinner, while the others were in the living room, Samantha approached me in the kitchen as I was putting away leftovers. I owe you an apology, she said, the words clearly difficult for her. I haven't been very welcoming to you over the years. Thank you for acknowledging that, I replied, not making it easier for her, but not being unkind either. The truth is, she continued, I've always been a bit competitive with James, and that extended to you after you married him. It wasn't fair. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The evening ended far more amicably than their last visit, with plans made for Ethan to spend a week with his grandparents during summer vacation. Something I would have been anxious about before, but now felt cautiously optimistic about. As the months passed, James and I continued our work in therapy, gradually rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than criticism disguised as care. There were still difficult moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, but we now had the tools and awareness to recognize and redirect those tendencies. One Sunday evening, almost a year after the pot roast incident, I was in the kitchen preparing a simple pasta dish when James came in and leaned against the counter watching me cook. What? I asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. I was just thinking about how much has changed, he said. A year ago, I probably would have suggested a different way to chop those tomatoes, or told you that pasta needed more sauce. I smiled, acknowledging the truth in his observation. And what would you say now? He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. Now I'd say I'm lucky to have a wife who puts so much love into feeding our family, and that I'm grateful for second chances. It wasn't always that smooth, of course. We still had disagreements, still sometimes fell into old communication traps. But the difference was that we now recognized them more quickly and had developed healthier ways to express our needs and concerns. The most profound change, though, was in how I approached cooking. What had once become a source of anxiety and insecurity had returned to being a creative outlet and expression of love. I cooked dishes that brought me joy, that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen, that made Ethan's face light up with delight. We had established a new Sunday dinner tradition where each family member took turns choosing the menu or contributing a dish. When it was Ethan's turn, the meals were often creative combinations that defied culinary convention, like his famous breakfast for dinner creations or his experimental pizza toppings. We celebrated his innovations with the same enthusiasm as any perfectly executed classic dish. On one such Sunday, as we sat around the table enjoying Ethan's latest creation pancakes topped with ice cream and fruit that he had proudly named Dinner Sundays, I looked at my little family and felt a surge of gratitude for how far we had come. "This is the best dinner ever," James declared, taking another bite of his ice cream-covered pancake. "Because it's made with love," Ethan asked, remembering his own words from that pivotal night. "Exactly," James agreed, meeting my eyes across the table with a smile that held all the understanding and appreciation that had once been so scarce. The secret ingredient that makes everything better. As I reflect on our journey, I'm struck by how often the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. It took my 8-year-old son's simple observation to break through years of established patterns and open the door to healing. 5 words, "Mom's food is made with love," changed the course of our family's story. I've learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always require grand gestures or perfect articulation of your feelings. Sometimes it simply means refusing to accept disrespect, even when it comes wrapped in familiar packaging from people who claim to love you. I've learned that true change is possible, but it requires honest acknowledgement of the problem and a genuine commitment to doing better. Most importantly, I've learned that love expressed through cooking, or any act of care, should never need to meet impossible standards to be worthy of appreciation. The value lies not in technical perfection, but in the intention behind the effort, the desire to nourish both body and soul. That knowledge has become the foundation of our renewed family life. A simple truth that guides us through the inevitable challenges of marriage and parenthood. When offered with love, even the most imperfect offerings deserve to be received with gratitude. Have you ever experienced someone criticizing something you pour your heart into? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need this reminder that they deserve respect for their efforts, no matter how perfect the results. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most powerful words come from the most unexpected voices.